And
Yes.
I remember thinking like, oh, but I'm not an angry person. And then
Exactly.
thinking,
I'm not an angry person.
right. And then thinking the next thoughts right after that,
Mhm,
maybe
mhm.
that there's something there to that.
Yep.
And that maybe the fact that I can't recognize or have
Mhm.
permission for feeling anger,
Right.
that maybe my body is storing something. And I was learning how to meditate and do some different things in response to the data that I was gathering about autoimmunity. And so I took
Mhm.
this word autoimmune into my meditation, and I thought, oh, auto means I'm doing this to myself. I'm destroying myself.
Mhm.
So
Attacking my own self.
when's the first time I wanted to die? And
Mhm.
that was interesting because I didn't want to die at the time I was sitting there meditating. And so I traced this
Right.
backwards and found this little 10-year-old girl version of myself that was being sexually abused by the
Mhm.
vice principal of the elementary school I was attending. And I
Mhm.
looked at her and I thought she wanted to die. Like
Yep.
that part of me definitely wanted off this planet.
Mhm.
And I thought, I know these are connected.
Yep.
This
Yep.
has to be connected. And my cells are just saying, okay. And
Yep.
it turns out that science does say that these past childhood traumas are connected to our adult health in some very, very compelling ways.
Mhm.
And I knew that back then, before the ACEs study was done, just by
Mhm.
looking at her face and going,
Yep.
oh.
Yep.
And
Mhm.
so by really diving in and working on that trauma and doing some work around my diet and, all those things that I do with my patients today,
Mhm.
all of it had to get done. If I would have ignored the trauma, there's no way this would have
Right.
happened. But my RA was gone in 6 months and it
Right.
hasn't been back. And
Yep.
so without taking the meds. And so
Mhm.
this is what's so interesting about this is that these early moments, and we can differentiate between capital T trauma and lowercase t trauma, but I went back to school after my RA was
Mhm.
gone, in remission, reversed, not cured. I could get it
Right.
back again. It's in my genetics,
Exactly.
you know.
That pattern is
So
still there and can be woken up again.
that's when I went back to
Mhm.
school and finished my bachelor's in nursing. And then I
Yep.
got my nurse practitioner. And then I got board certified in functional medicine and a master's degree in Ayurvedic medicine. And then
Mhm.
several years later, as I was contemplating this, why did the ACEs study
Mhm.
come up with it, what it
Yep.
did? Like, how is that process? Then I did the HERT study for my doctoral work in 2013. And so
Mhm.
it's just been this like ongoing pursuit of every time a question comes up,
Yep.
I'll want an answer to it, and I'll
Right.
either go back to school or get another certification or do
Mhm.
my own study. And
Yep.
so that's the long and short of it.
Well, and thank you for that. And it's interesting because when you describe looking back and finding that 10-year-old self that had wanted to die, that's exactly the same age that I look back and see that in myself. And
Mhm.
it wasn't something that I had consciously remembered,
Right.
but I have a Mexican mom. She's been in my life since about age 8 or 9. And she told me probably a year ago, do you remember that when you were 10, we had that conversation and you told me you wanted to die?
Mm.
And I hadn't remembered that conversation. But it makes so much sense seeing the time points at which certain physical symptoms started to hit me after, again, also very much like you, running marathons and was an avid cyclist and biker and was always very active, was in general surgery residency at the time. So just always very, very active, very on the go, very perfectionistic. And yet looking back, I would say that I don't have that story like you that I can point back to and say, well, that was the reason
Mhm.
that that little girl wanted to die already. And so for me, there's been a lot of reframing around traumas, right? And what would be considered a big T trauma, a little T
Right.
trauma, and how even if you don't really relate to having trauma, it's it's not really about events and stories. It's about, do you have these patterns in your nervous system? Did these types of experiences and patterns get stored in your nervous system that it's causing these biological consequences later on in life? It's it's less important to remember an event
Yeah.
or associate something with trauma.
It's not even necessary at all. And people get worried
Yep,
about that. Do I have
they
to go
do.
relive, or I don't
Yep,
even remember my childhood? Is that a
right,
problem? And I say, oh no, absolutely not. And when you can't
right.
remember your childhood, there's a reason for that.
There's a reason for that too.
But it doesn't
Mhm.
matter. It doesn't
Right,
mean that you have to go dig in and go under hypnosis and
exactly.
figure it out. Like none
Right.
of that is necessary
Mhm.
in order to do
Mm,
the work that I
mm.
did that reversed my RA
Yep.
and what I teach now. So it's people, our stories are constructs, and the more we tell them, the more real they become. But at
Yep.
the end of the day, it's not the story that is
Right.
as important, because in the story, I
Mhm.
always say, in the story is where your trauma lies.
Mhm.
So if you look around you as an adult and you don't feel safe, you don't feel good enough, you don't feel like you can trust
Mhm.
the world, you don't feel, all of these things, or you feel like you have to caretake everybody and not yourself, that right there is your story. And
Yep.
that comes
Mhm.
from this meaning. And in my hurt model, I
Mhm.
can kind of track how that all happens. But
Mhm.
it's it's like, oh, now that I have a fully developed
Mhm.
brain, I can go back and I can take a look at these meanings that I created,
Mhm.
and adaptive behaviors for a child that may not be so adaptive for my adult version.
Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And that's where the hope is, right? That we're
Mhm.
not stuck with whatever it is with our health conditions, but specifically autoimmune is definitely associated with unresolved anger, unexpressed anger that we turn towards ourselves. And so it's often the people that are the people pleasers, that are the really nice ones, that actually have this anger that they just turn towards themselves rather than expressing it.
And the
And
driven ones.
and the driven ones. Yes. And there's even some cancers that are also associated with that unresolved anger. So, one of the things that I love that we both kind of landed on is functional medicine, and that's definitely kind of what helped me shift out of that and learn what tools I needed. But let's go deeper into your hurt study, and then we can pull in some of the functional medicine stuff and actually look at maybe some of the biological things that we can do to support our body during even a diagnosis, or to pull ourselves out of an autoimmune. What are some of the more biological things that we can do for resolving trauma? But I'd love to have you share more of your hurt study and the results that you found with that.
Unless you take that opportunity to open
Mhm.
up that little tiny, tiny gap
Yep.
and do it a little differently.
Mhm.
And then you've created different karma for yourself, like you're going to do it differently from now on. And that's, to me, remarkable. Like, perception is everything. It is not about your nervous system. It is
Mhm.
not about your nervous system. It's
Mhm.
about the perception that triggers your nervous system.
Right.
And
Mhm.
so getting above that is the most important thing, right?
Yep.
And so that's what's so fascinating to me. It's we tend to be very reductionist in our culture, and we want to distill everything down and go, okay, here's the one thing I can do, and here's the one reason I'm sick, and here's the one reason. And
Mhm.
it's not that ever,
Mhm. Right.
ever. It's
Mhm.
always critical mass. People want to make it about their Epstein-Barr virus, or
Mhm.
and yes, that is.
Yeah.
I use something
Part of
called
it.
the
Mhm.
freedom framework, where I look at
Mhm.
the four corners of your puzzle, and we're all
Yep.
unique in our puzzles. So we have our genetics, we have our gut
Mhm.
health, we have our toxic load, and we have our stress and trauma, and all of them interact with each other, right? So of course
Mhm.
Epstein-Barr is a player in this. It's one of the toxic burdens,
Yep.
but it's never the only thing. Otherwise, 95% of Americans would have autoimmunity,
Yep.
because 95% of Americans have Epstein-Barr virus.
Yes.
So, it's like
There's
that math
something else.
doesn't work,
Mhm. Right.
And so
Mhm.
we have to go to our own perceptions and start
Yep.
to look at them,
Mhm.
and how often am I perceiving myself as offended, or I need to defend my
Mhm.
worldview in some way, or myself, or like,
Yep.
how often am I in this right or wrong, black and white thinking? How often do
Mhm.
I find myself in the should, coulds, all of those? And they're not bad, none of it's bad. How
Yep.
often do I lock myself into what I call the tyranny of positive thinking, where
Yep.
I'm not even allowed to feel anxious because I've judged it as a bad emotion.
Right.
Like that too is,
Mhm.
it's like,
Mhm.
oh, this is so fascinating. It's
Mhm.
so
Right.
fascinating. And each one of us is unique in this. There's
Mhm.
not like one way that all of this unravels. It's
Mhm.
there's just your own unique
Mhm.
story and how you're telling it, and then what needs to happen for you to start approaching it from a different awareness.
Yep. Mhm. And understanding like there's so much that goes on in the body, in the biology that's connected with all of that. So you really can't separate your belief system from your biology because it becomes
Yes.
one and the same.
Yeah, the
Like,
perceptions activate the neurotransmitters that then tell
mhm,
the adrenals to go off because they
right,
say, now you're a zebra being chased by a lion.
exactly.
And that cortisol that's released is what's breaking down your gut. And then
Mhm,
that gut brain broken down and the food molecules making their way
mhm,
so that the immune system's attacking them.
mhm,
That hypervigilant immune system is now having your genetics express themselves in a disease
mhm.
state. Like it's
Yep.
all interwoven.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then it's no wonder that the biology gets overwhelmed and you have adults who are living in this chronic functional freeze state where they're
I
just
can
walking
only eat
around.
5 things. I'm on a shrinking iceberg of things that I can do in my
Right.
life. I'm in
Right.
perpetual pain, like that.
Yep.
That always
Yep.
breaks my heart. I say,
Yep.
yes, okay. Well,
Mhm.
let's get you off the ice floe and let's get you
Right.
on solid ground, and we can do
Mhm.
that.
Mhm.
And we can
Mhm.
reverse all of this. But it
Mhm.
is not all about L-glutamine.
Right.
That
Mhm.
is a piece of it.
A
And
piece of
it's
it, sure.
yeah, and it isn't about shrinking your menu.
Mhm.
That is a
Mm.
piece of it for a period of
Right.
time, but not forever.
Mm.
So it is important that all of it is dealt with at the same time.
Mhm.